All right, get ready to dive deep with us today because we're tackling a big one: existence.
Nothing bigger, right?
You sent over part of the Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry on existence. And, well, things get pretty interesting.
For sure. It's one of those ideas we take for granted, but when you try to actually define existence, it can get kind of tricky.
Absolutely. I mean, is it something like an actual property, like being red or being tall?
Right. Or is it something else completely? The source material actually jumps right into that debate, comparing individuals and properties. Like individuals would be, I don't know, you, me, this microphone.
Right, the thing's kind of doing the existing, right?
Yeah. And the properties would be like how those things are. So hot, blue, round.
Even imaginary. So some philosophers have actually argued that existence is a distinct property.
Yeah, the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. He thought that a unicorn, let's say, could have all the usual unicorn properties.
Horn, magical powers, the whole deal.
But then, like, on top of that, it could either have or lack the property of existence.
Okay, but others were like, yep, not buying it.
Exact. We've got some big names on that side, too. Aristotle, Hume, Kant, all pushing back against the idea of existence as a property.
So for them, it's like you can't separate a thing's existence from the thing itself.
Right, like it's baked into the very concept of the thing. Hume thought all our ideas ultimately come from our senses, right?
So if we can't sense existence as separate from a thing's other qualities, maybe it's not really a property like we usually think of properties.
Makes sense. But then how do we make sense of like saying something exists versus it doesn't exist? Because it does feel different to say there's a cat on the mat versus there is no cat on the mat.
It's like that difference feels real. But if existence isn't a property of the cat itself, what are we even talking about?
And that's where Frege and Russell come in.
Ooh, yeah, the source material mentioned them. What do they have to say?
Well, they propose this really mind-bending solution. Existence isn't a property of things, but a property of concepts.
Wait, whoa. Can we, back up for a second?
Sure, sure.
I'm going to need, the 5-year-old version of that one.
Okay, so imagine we're talking about, I don't know, Bigfoot.
Okay, Bigfoot, I'm with you.
Now, instead of saying Bigfoot exists or Bigfoot doesn't exist, what Frege and Russell are saying is we're really talking about the concept of Bigfoot.
So, like this idea of a large, hairy creature in the woods.
Exactly. And what we're really asking is whether that concept actually has any examples out there in the real world.
Oh, okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So it's not about Bigfoot himself having or lacking this, mystical existence property. It's about whether the whole idea of Bigfoot matches up with anything real.
Exactly. It's like when we say dragons don't exist, we're not saying there's these sad, non-existent dragons out there somewhere. We're saying the concept of a dragon doesn't have a match in reality.
That's so clever. So we don't have to worry about, the Loch Ness Monster swimming around Scotland just because we can talk about it. But does that mean that, Frege and Russell are saying that our language tricks us into thinking about existence in the wrong way?
Kind of, yeah. They argue that these sentences like Santa Claus doesn't exist actually have this hidden, more complex structure.
So it's not just a simple sentence about Santa himself, right?
Right, it's not like Santa as the subject and doesn't exist as the predicate, like some simple property.
Okay, so then what are we saying when we make those kinds of claims?
It's more about whether a certain set of properties has any examples out there.
Okay.
So Santa Claus doesn't exist would really mean like there's no thing that has all the properties we associate with Santa. Lives at the North Pole, delivers presents, jolly red suit, the whole 9 yards.
So we're talking about all those Santa-related properties together.
Exactly. And that way, we don't need any non-existent objects hanging around. It's all about whether that concept of Santa actually lines up with reality.
I really like how this makes us think differently about how we use those words, exists and doesn't exist. I feel like we use them all the time without really thinking about what they mean.
Yeah, it's like this hidden layer of meaning we've uncovered. And this idea that existence belongs to concepts, not things themselves, it's been really influential in philosophy. It helps us understand how we can talk about things that don't exist without implying that they're, out there somewhere in a realm of non-being.
Right, right. So we've got this Frege-Russell view, but I get the feeling there are other ways of thinking about existence, right? The source material mentioned some other, maybe even more mind-bending views.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So last time we were kind of grappling with this idea that existence might not be about the things themselves, but about the concepts we have of those things.
It was a lot to take in, for sure. But like you said, there are other, even more, I guess you could say, mind-bending views out there. So what are some of the other ways philosophers have thought about existence, especially when it comes to things that don't seem to exist in the, everyday world.
Well, that's where we get to this idea called Meinongianism.
Meinongianism. Okay, I've definitely never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's named after this Austrian philosopher, Alexius Meinong. And he had some pretty radical ideas about existence. Like, he basically said, yeah, there are things that don't exist.
Wait, so we're talking about like ghosts and alternate dimensions and stuff.
Not quite. Meinong was more focused on things like fictional characters, like mythical creatures,
Oh, okay.
even impossible objects, things we can definitely think about and talk about, even though they don't seem to be in the same way as, say, that chair or the trees outside.
So like a unicorn, for example. It's not like we can go find one at the zoo.
Exactly, but for Meinong, that unicorn doesn't just exist as a concept in our minds. It has some kind of being, even if it doesn't exist in our world.
I'm trying to picture this. So there's like a difference between being and existing?
It's a core idea in Meinongianism. Like, everything is in some sense, even the things that don't exist.
So a unicorn is but doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's the basic distinction, and as you might imagine, it's led to a lot of debate among philosophers. But the key idea here is that these non-existent objects, they still have properties.
Okay, so they're not just empty ideas, right? They have characteristics we can talk about.
Right, right. Like, we can say that Pegasus, the winged horse, he's a horse, he has wings, he's probably, like, really majestic. Those are all properties, even if Pegasus doesn't exist in the way we experience the world.
Okay, I mean, that makes sense, I guess, but if something doesn't actually exist, how can we even talk about its properties in a meaningful way? Doesn't that just lead to all sorts of contradictions?
You're hitting on a major challenge for Meinongianism. In fact, Bertrand Russell, who was talked about earlier, he was a big critic of Meinon's ideas.
What did he think was wrong with it?
Well, Russell was worried that allowing these non-existent objects into our ontology, that's just a fancy word for like what we consider to be, he thought it would create all sorts of logical problems.
So it's like if we say Pegasus doesn't exist, doesn't that already assume there is a Pegasus to talk about? It's a bit of a philosophical head-scratcher, right?
Exactly. I mean, Meinongians have to be very careful about how they talk about these non-existent objects. They often make distinctions between different levels or like modes of being and how we describe them.
Okay, like what kinds of distinctions? Break it down for me.
Sure. So they might say that like fictional characters, they have a kind of subsistence or like a being so, and that's different from full-blown existence.
So there are different flavors of non-existence.
I guess you could say that. And then they also distinguish between like internal and external properties.
Internal and external. I don't think I've heard that before.
It might sound a bit technical, but think of it this way. Internal properties, those are the ones that define an object's, essential nature.
Okay,
So like with Pegasus, his hoarseness, that's internal, the wings, also internal.
gotcha. But like his location, since he's not actually real, that wouldn't be an internal property.
Exactly. That would be an internal property. It's about like where the object is in the world.
So Pegasus has the internal property of having wings, but he doesn't have the external property of, say, being in my backyard.
Right. And by making that distinction, Meinongians can say things like Pegasus can fly. And it's true.
Because we're talking about his internal nature?
Exactly. It's a true statement about Pegasus as a concept, but it doesn't mean he exists in the same way as, say, a bird. But even with all these distinctions, Meinongianism still faces some tricky issues.
Like what?
Well, what about impossible objects? Like a classic example is a round square.
Yeah, I remember those from geometry class, I think.
Right, and the source material actually mentions this exact example because if we allow round squares into our ontology, we're basically allowing contradictions to be true, which is a big problem for logic.
Yeah, because it would have to be both round and not round at the same time.
Exactly. So how do Meinongians respond to that? Well, some try to refine the theory by introducing even more nuanced ways of talking about these non-existent objects.
More nuances, okay.
They might say that impossible objects like that round square, they have this weaker kind of being, or maybe they only exist as like conceptual objects in our minds.
So even within Meinongianism, there are, like, levels of non-existence.
It gets pretty complex, but that's the general idea. It's this really interesting attempt to like map out the boundaries of what we can think and talk about.
Okay, so we've got the Frege and Russell view, where existence is a property of concepts. Then we've got the Meinongians saying that, well, some things don't exist, but they still have being in some way. Are those the only two options, or are there other major philosophical camps on this?
There's actually one more view we should touch on that the source material mentions. It tries to find sort of a middle ground.
Oh, okay, tell me more.
It's the idea that existence actually is a property, but it's a universal property, meaning everything exists.
Wait a minute. Everything, even like Santa Claus in a round square? How does that even work? Okay, so we're back, and my brain is still doing backflips from that last round of philosophical gymnastics. We've got Frege and Russell saying existence is all about concepts, not things themselves. Then there are the Menongians basically saying, nope, some things don't exist but still are in some way. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It definitely stretches the boundaries of how we think about the world. And now we're on to the third contender in this philosophical wrestling match, the view that tries to find that middle ground.
Right, right. And if I'm limiting correctly, this view says that existence is a property, but a universal one. So does that mean everything from my cat to the idea of world peace exists on the same level?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. This view suggests that when we say something like unicorns don't exist, we're not denying their existence entirely. It's more like saying unicorns don't exist as concrete entities.
Okay, so there's like a unicorn, but it's not the kind of unicorn I'd see prancing through a meadow. More like an abstract concept of unicornness.
That's getting closer. This approach proposes that everything exists, but maybe not in the way we typically imagine. Some things exist concretely, like this microphone or the stars in the sky. But other things might exist in a different way, like as possibilities or abstract concepts.
I think you're following. So it kind of acknowledges the reality of things like fictional characters and numbers without making them concrete things in our world.
Exactly, and that helps avoid some of the sticky logical problems we ran into with the other views.
Okay, but how does this idea handle things coming into being or ceasing to be? Like, the dinosaurs did exist, but now they don't. Does that mean they still exist in some non-concrete way?
That's a really insightful question, and that's where this view gets particularly interesting. Philosophers who support this idea often point to concreteness as the key to solving this puzzle. And concreteness, in this sense, means being part of our physical world, having a specific location in space and time.
So instead of asking, does X exist, we should be asking, is X concrete?
You got it. And making that shift in thinking might help resolve some of those philosophical knots we've been untangling. For example, instead of saying time travel doesn't exist, we could say time travel is not concrete.
Right, because we don't know if it's actually possible.
Precisely. It might exist as a concept, but it's not something we can actually experience yet. Anyway,
So it avoids making claims about whether it's possible or not. It's just not currently concrete.
that's the idea.
I can see how this view really opens up possibilities without having to believe that round squares are rolling around somewhere. But how do these thinkers deal with, like, time and change if everything exists, even the stuff that's not concrete? It seems like everything is just, like, eternally there.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges with this view. And the source material kind of touches on a couple of ideas, actualism and presentism, which offer different ways of thinking about time and existence.
So actualism, is that, like, saying that only the things that are, like, actually real right now exist?
That's a good way to put it. Actualism says that only things that are actual exist. No shadowy realm of potential objects waiting to become real. Everything that exists is already here.
Okay. And presentism, is that something similar?
Yeah, presentism is a bit similar, but focused more on time. It basically says that only the present moment exists. The past is gone, and the future hasn't happened yet.
Okay, so then how do those ideas square with, like, this universal view of existence? Because if everything exists timelessly, then the whole idea of past, present, and future kind of breaks down, doesn't it?
That's the key tension. If everything exists, but concreteness is what ties it to a specific time, we have to figure out how things move in and out of concreteness.
So something can exist without being concrete, but then become concrete later on. So, like, the dinosaurs are still out there somewhere, just not concrete anymore.
That's one way to think about it. Some philosophers argue that things that are no longer concrete might still exist as maybe a collection of properties or as a part of history and our memories, even if they're not physically present.
Wow, this is a lot to process. I'm starting to see that this whole question of existence is a lot more complex and layered than I ever realized.
Right. It's not just a simple yes or no answer.
It's like we're looking at reality through a whole new lens. And suddenly all those boundaries between what is and what is not are a lot blurrier than we thought.
It's definitely a mind-expanding topic.
So where does this leave us? What should our listeners be chewing on as they ponder the mysteries of existence?
Well, I think the big takeaway here is that there's no one right answer to the question of what exists. There are all these different ways of approaching the problem, and each one sheds light on different aspects of reality.
It's like each view is a different tool for understanding existence, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about philosophy. It encourages us to look beyond the surface, to question our assumptions, and to explore the endless possibilities of what might be.
So the next time someone says that doesn't exist, maybe take a moment to think about what they really mean. It might just spark a whole new way of seeing the world.
Absolutely. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those deep dives going.